thanks for joining us for this episode where we're going to be talking about vulnerability management reporting and specifically how important it is to communicate because it's important.
Yes, it most definitely is. You know, when we think about it, right, a vulnerability, you know, going through the whole process of identifying vulnerabilities within your system is important, but at the end of the day, what your company has paid for, what your company is interested in are the findings. What did we actually find? What were the results? What were the outcomes? Right? When we talk about vulnerability reporting, you know, what were the details of the weaknesses within our organization? We classify, we rate these vulnerabilities, right, so that we can prioritize them. At the end of the day, what they really want is that report. And remember that you, as a cybersecurity analyst, one of the jobs that you're going to have is to communicate that. Because remember, when we talk about vulnerabilities, vulnerabilities can be exploited by your threat actors. Your threat actors can use those to, you know, maybe cause a data breach. And at the end of the day, those vulnerability reports let us know what we need to take care of. They also let us know where we currently sit and can help assist in risk management when it comes to establishing what the current security posture is of your organization.
When you're reporting this stuff, your audience might vary, right? You might be talking to like the C-suite, in which case maybe there's not a whole lot of technical background there, so you really have to know who you're talking to explain it, right?
Absolutely. We got to identify the stakeholders that we have, right? And really anybody, a stakeholder is anybody that's not involved, generically speaking, within this process of doing the reporting and still needs information. Let's take a look here. So when we talk about knowing your audience, that's a really good statement, Sophia, because let's take the first one that she mentioned, right? Let's take executives, right? So an executive doesn't need to know the technical details. They might be a non-technical person. Now, when I say non-technical person, let's be careful on that, because if you have a CTO, if you have a CISO, right, the Chief Information Security Officer, the C-level, the Chief Technology Officer, those are probably technical people. But even at that level, all right, you have to remember that what they want is just a high-level overview, right? The high-level overview reporting what are your key findings, right? But that's a little bit different from somebody that's like a manager, right? A manager or a department head. I just lumped them all under managers. It really, and here's another thing, you know, if you talk to one of our other experts in here about security, Dan Lowry, one of the things that he'll let you know is that when it comes to security, right, you have to tailor it for your organization, right? We're giving you some examples of stakeholders, but every company is a little bit different, right? You might have a public-facing interest. A lot of us have customers that we have to talk to. They might be stakeholders here as well. But what you communicate with a C-level executive is going to be different than what you communicate with maybe a management or a department head, right? They're going to be the ones that are going to oversee, right, provide oversight with their team, where the C-level executives, they get the high-level summary and they make key decisions based on your report and the outcomes that you find. So other ones that we have, general employees, right? They're still going to be a stakeholder inside of our, as far as vulnerability management. This is one of the reasons we have end-user security awareness training. Why don't you, open that email from somebody that looks like it's legit, but we don't really care. Let's just go ahead and click it and open it, right? So vulnerability management and the reports of vulnerability are also important as well to even general employees. But the way we communicate those things might be in a very, very non-technical way, right? We don't come in and we don't start saying CVEs and CVSS and the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Nobody cares about that if they're a general employee. They just want to know, does this mean that I don't connect to social media on a computer, that's owned by the company, right? So it is a little bit different, I'm sure you've seen that before. In fact, let's take us here in, in ACI Learning, right? Don Pizzette is the founder of IT Pro TV, right? We're now part of one family. He was the CTO for a while, and one of the things that he did is develop an end-user security awareness training program that everyone had to go through. But what he communicates to the average employee is going to be much different than what he's going to communicate to our acting CTO today, right? So those conversations are a little bit different. We need to be aware of that.
Because I always think of know your audience as like know how to phrase things and what kind of terms to use. Because like you said, maybe don't get as technical with it depending on what level you're at. But you're saying also the content you're communicating might change too.
It very well could.
Okay.
It very well could, right? So check the executive summary, if I could say that, right? Communication. Imagine that. But we're just extracting key points. That document could be 100 pages long, right? But at the end of the day, when I put spreadsheets and charts, right? Executives like spreadsheets and charts up there, right? It's just going to be a distillation of the information again versus an in-depth, detailed, conversation. Now, the next one that we have in the list, the IT staff. The IT staff, that's a little bit different, right? The IT staff, they are the technical people. Right now, we can get technical. We can say, all right, well, we have some CPUs over here that are susceptible to the Spectre attack, right? The meltdown attack years ago now. But anyways, right, they would understand what we're talking about when we start to use the jargon. We start to use the acronyms, IT, we can't speak unless we're speaking in alphabet soup, right? Well, we need to actually convey those in something that's meaningful. Remember, you can have data, but it only becomes information if the people that you're explaining it to understand what you're explaining. Just having data for the sake of having data isn't really going to benefit you. Like take another team, your development team, very highly technical people that understand a lot of times your product at the lowest levels, where maybe even your executives don't even know what's going on down at that level. So if you look at it from top to bottom, right, we have non-technical, maybe extremely non-technical in the general employees there, but then we start getting back to technical and then highly technical employees. So your communication that you convey to those people have to be different given who they are.
And with a vulnerability, when you're reporting vulnerabilities, what you're doing is you're kind of reporting what you found, right? Mm-hmm. And then you're reporting, what does that mean? What exactly was affected? What systems or whatever it might be, right? Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about that, right? When we talk about reporting existing vulnerabilities, that's something that's also has to be taken into consideration. Sophia and I were talking before we went live in this episode, and if you tell me you're telling me as a part of the report that I have 500 vulnerabilities, and I'm like, oh, wow, I'm probably going to lose some sleep for the next couple of weeks, only to turn around and find out that only one of those was directly affecting your systems, and all 499, I'm just giving a ballpark number here, right? 499 of them needed some specific situation, and the stars had to be aligned. You needed a clean room with no oxygen in it. It's the only way it's going to happen. Well, I probably don't really care to report those to the executive board, right? The executive summary might not include those. It'll say, no, but there's 3 of these that we really need to work on right now. So let's talk a little bit more about that, right? What was discovered, right? I don't care about everything that was discovered, right? Because if we can really get bogged down into the weeds. If you've ever opened up a CVE chart, there are hundreds of thousands of entries in there. And you could, common vulnerabilities exposure. You might be exposed to a vulnerability, but it needs just the right circumstances to ever happen. Or maybe if it does happen, right? It doesn't really matter, right? So for instance, let's say if I put the security mechanisms and controls on the server closet, probably going to be a little bit different than the security controls I put on the break room.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So it's not about securing everything. At this point, it's about what is the most important. And remember, you have to convey this to your audience. So for instance, we talk about what was discovered on what, right? We talk about what hosts were affected, right? What processes were affected. Now, was it a process running on a system, or is it a business process that needs to be changed, right? We have things like, for instance, incident response plans, and we might find out later that, hey, we need to change some of our processes within our business. It could also be things like, for instance, it could be the software. Do we have a line of business application that maybe is communicating from a front-end web server to a back-end database, right? And anywhere in between. So we have to find out what is going on with the vulnerabilities, but at the end of the day, when we look at the network, the software, the processes, and the host, it's really about reporting what is the most critical.
So speaking of that, you were talking about, like, just as a random number, 500 vulnerabilities, but 499 are not that important. Maybe you have a couple that are important, maybe you've got 5 that it's like, we need to pay attention to these. How do you order them or decide what's most important?
Yes, absolutely. Part of a cybersecurity analyst is that you do have to classify what these vulnerabilities are. So for instance, you have to understand what the risk score is, right? The risk score is just it's a mathematical operation. What is the impact versus the likelihood, impact, severity? And that a lot of times is going to be based on some metrics that you can look at. Are these internal or are they external? Because remember, we can have vulnerabilities that are internal and unintentional. That could be intentional. You could have an insider threat, right? But they could be unintentional, right? A lot of times humans have the best best of intentions, and sometimes the best of those intentions can really lead to the worst outcomes, right? So for instance, somebody comes up to the door and says, hey, I know that person that's in the back office, I need to go talk to them. It's very, very important, lets them in without an access control roster, without, formal communication, with documentation, right? So that could be an internal threat. We also have to know what the external threats are too. And when we can do that, we can, essentially we can start some prioritization, right? We can use things like, for instance, we can use something like our risk severity, right? We talk about our risk score. What is the likelihood that something's going to happen? What is the risk severity, right? This is a vulnerability assessment form that I've got, and you all can get this too. It's out there online. I would encourage you to go to some place like Smartsheets or go to NIST. NIST is basically an American body that has endorsed by ANSI for security standards, right? So you can get this information too. But inside of this, we have what are known as these matrix, right? And here's a really good one. I like this one here too. And it lets you know what is the risk, right? Is it low, acceptable, to all the way up to extreme as being intolerable, right? We have to fix this right now. We cannot wait, right? You can use these to identify the risk score of a single risk event, or it could really be something like a risk score for your entire company. What is a generalized score that denotes what the current security posture is for your entire organization, right? So we have to keep these things also in mind too. Other things that I want you to be aware of is that it is up to you to provide the interpretation for that report, right? Yeah, I hand you this report, it's got a bunch of colors and graphs and everything, but if you don't know how to interpret it, it's really not going to benefit the people that you're presenting it to. So you as an analyst, you have to provide that interpretation based on those scores so that you can present accurate information. Because remember, this type of reporting and getting this right can be the difference between a company keeping the lights on and never existing again after this, right? So it is a very crucial thing, and it is one of the most critical things of the vulnerability management process, is the report at the end of the day that shows what did we find, right? What do we have to do? And then finally, like I said, remember your non-technical employees, all right? They don't care about things like MITRE framework. They don't care about the diamond model of intrusion and CVSs and all these technical jargon. What they want to know at the end of the day is, how does this affect me? I'm a stakeholder. What role do I play in this? And how can I assist in helping the security of the organization?
And it's important to not only to figure out exactly how serious the issue you're dealing with is. If you've got 10 vulnerabilities, but they all rate low on that matrix, it's like, okay, let's fix them, but we're doing pretty good. If you've got only 3, but they're all critical, that's rough. And then it also helps you to figure out what order do you tackle these in? What's the most important? Let's figure that one out first.
Definitely, right? For instance, like I said, I might not need that, the pin pad to get into the break room, right? It might be a public area, but you might have something that's like a public access area where everybody can get into, and if we don't fix that, then there could be some kind of external threat. But like Sophia says, it helps you to prioritize, right? We want to know, what do we tackle first, right? And based on the interpretation of the vulnerability management report, we can say, we need to tackle this one right. It has a high probability and the impact is great, right? And then you can use those matrix in order to, after you've classified, to get some kind of pecking order, if you will, right? What do we prioritize? What do we tackle first? And then what is the reasoning behind that, right? If I say, hey, well, I can make this secure, but you're going to have to throw $2 million at it to make it secure. Well, is that bad? Well, it might not be. If you've got a company that is making $100 million and this $2 million they throw at this control they throw at this saves them, $50 million in GDPR violations, then the reasoning might be, yes, we need to tackle that because, yes, it's a lot of money, but it's also a high impact, and it really can affect things like brand reputation. You think about reputation, right? All I have to do right now in my mind is think of somebody like Enron. They'll never get a reputation back, right? In fact, they were the reason we have some of these regulations and laws today because of the crooked stuff that they were doing behind the scenes. But it doesn't have to be an intentional malfeasance that has to happen to lose your reputation. So not only do you prioritize to what to tackle first, you also have to provide a reasoning behind why you're going to tackle those first and maybe push some of those other to the back burner to say, and maybe tackle them in, I don't know, a few weeks or, however long it might be.
And this comes back to that communication again, right? Communicating what exactly the issue is, how we can fix it, and what we're going to do to fix it, right?
That's right. That comes into communicating the remediation process, right? The remediation process is how do we implement the restorative controls to bring our systems back into compliance with whatever the obligation might be. It could be a regulation. It might just be an obligation through things like SLAs, right? You might have a service level agreement that you're providing to your customer that says we can't afford an outage, and if we have an outage, we're starting to lose money, and we might have to credit people back, losing even more money. So it is important that in the remediation process that we tackle two things, configuration management and patch management, and they are not in any way separate. They hold hands, right? Change management, configuration management, and patch management all are in the same, they're all at the same table, right? So when I say configuration management, if we find systems that are highly impacted, we need to identify those systems and communicate those systems. What are the systems that were most highly impacted by whatever the vulnerabilities are that we have followed or found, excuse me. What are the proposed changes, right? What are that we want to, maybe safeguard? What are the controls that we're going to put into place to mitigate whatever this vulnerability is? And then finally, what are the risks associated? Now, when I say risks associated with, we have to consider that it could be a risk of not changing it. It could also be the risk of changing it. And what do I mean by that? Downtime.
Right.
That's one of the big things is downtime, right? Yes, we implement the change, but it's going to take us 6 hours through some of our peak hours of the day. There was one time I remember when LL Bean, when I was teaching one class, we had a student in that class said that he'd worked at LL Bean. And he said something astronomical, like $10 million an hour they were losing if they didn't have access to a certain server, right?
Wow.
So the risk of not changing it versus changing it also has to be proposed. And you have to tell them, well, if we change this, this is the benefit that we're going to actualize out of it. But if we don't change it, this is the impact that we're going to actualize it. And it's going to be you might be that person or a team collectively of people. You might, a lot of times it's going to be a team. And you have to convey that. And that goes down now that once we know the highly impacted systems, how are we going to patch them, right? And remember, this is where the last option comes in, or the last thing that we have to talk about, and that's patch management. Remember the purpose of patch management, all right? If you're in a home environment where you maybe click updates, all right, there's no problem. You don't need documentation. But if you have systems that you need to apply a change to through some kind of security patch, and they can go offline and bring your entire infrastructure down if it's not implemented in the right fashion, we have to have that systematic approach, and that's where patch management comes in. This is part of that remediation. This is the part of the actions that bring us back online, right? We have to find out what are the systems, again, you'll see that's almost a repeat. What are the impacted systems? The highly impacted systems are the ones that we're going to patch first. How are we going to patch and what are the proposed updates, right? What is the associated information with that proposed update? So for instance, Microsoft releases a patch, Cisco releases a patch, name Juniper, whoever the system is that you're patching, they release a patch. They usually have a lot of information about those updates, what they fix and what systems they apply to. So you also have to what patches are we going to apply? And then last but not least, just like before, what's the reasoning behind it? Now, the reason I say that, well, that's redundant. The reason of the reasoning, the reason I say that is because they're going to be relying on you. That report is what they've paid for at the end of the day, and it's up to you as an analyst to give them the appropriate level of interpretation based on who the stakeholder is.
Right. They want to know that this isn't just, here's what you need to do. They want to know, well, why? What exactly is the reasoning behind the reasons that you're giving us for the redundant Department of Redundancy?
Absolutely. We'll just look for redundant next to redundant.
And communication's key through this whole process, like we talked about, knowing your audience, knowing what to communicate and how technical to get or not technical in some cases, right? Talking about classifying your vulnerabilities so that you can figure out how to prioritize that remediation. And then what was that last step? Communicating that
communication,
process, right? Yeah,
just communicate that process and make sure that you provide the reasoning behind it.
All right, well, that's going to wrap us up, right? I think that's all we've got for this episode on vulnerability management reporting.
That's
I speak
right.
English. Vulnerability management reporting. So thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We'll see you next time.